and welcome to the first of this year's Edinburgh Fringe Preview podcasts. In a while, you'll hear all about the show's Tell Me and target audience. But first, I spoke to Ed Gamester about Mythos Ragnarök. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Scots Whay Hae Fringe podcast for this year. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Gamester. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Alistair. Thank you for having me.
And we're here to talk about your show, Mythos Ragnarök, and even the title has got me excited. But you're the creator and lead actor of the show.
I am, yeah. I wrote it 5 years ago as an experiment into a new form of physical theatre. And I've sort of become the lead actor over the course of 5 years. I've stepped in where I've needed to, put it that way.
So tell us all about Mythos Ragnarök.
Well, it's an adaptation of ancient Norse mythology, centered around the primary storyline of Ragnarok, the creation and the eventual destruction of the world. But the concept, what I wanted to play with was trying to look at a new interpretation of that ancient myth, but also a new way of presenting it. So a different version of the story, but also presented in a way that no one had seen before, for which I chose the storytelling medium of professional wrestling, because I feel like it's an untapped medium in terms of its storytelling potential, something that had never been done before, but also something in which I'm very experienced as a wrestler myself. So something I feel I could do justice to, rather than just kind of jump on a bandwagon of trying to crowbar wrestling in wherever you can, because it's got a bit of a hype behind it. So yeah, it felt like something I understood very well and could do my own version of.
I mean, that's interesting because, I mean, people who maybe don't follow wrestling, there is, at least in some types of wrestling, a storytelling aspect to it. There are heroes and villains and all of those things.
Absolutely. It's entirely storytelling. The physicality within wrestling is simply a medium to get yourself to the next part of the story. No wrestling match really exists in isolation. Either they're part of a wider storyline, or the wrestling match itself has a storyline written within the physicality itself. That's what makes it engaging and makes it one of the most watched forms of theatre on earth.
So well, first of all, where can people see it and when? Let's pull that up front.
Mythos Ragnarok.
Yep.
It's going to be on all throughout the Edinburgh Fringe. It's going to be in the assembly rooms, in the biggest assembly room, the music hall, which is
Right.
a beautiful venue, a really large venue as well for the Fringe. It's about 700 people.
Yeah.
So we get some big audiences in there, and it allows us to put on something really very visually spectacular as well, because lots of Fringe shows, obviously, part of the charm is that they're small and they're compact into a tiny space. We've outgrown that over 5 years. About 10,000 people came to see us last year, so we need a big old space these days to do something that's really closer to theatre than it is to a Fringe performance.
That is a great room to be in. And so you've put the show on at the Fringe for 5 years. This is the fifth year or the sixth year?
This will be the 5th year, yeah.
Right, okay. And how has it grown? How did you start? Was it small rooms in, the back of an attic or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was never by Fringe standards, it's never been small. So even our first year, we were in a 140 seat venue for the Gilded Balloon,
Yeah.
in the Paterhouse upstairs, which is an expression I had to learn how to say, Alistair. I didn't understand how to say Paterhouse. I'm not sure I still do. But yeah, we started there 5 years ago. And the first time we ever performed, we had one paying audience member and then a couple of friends, which was scary for a show that I self-produce and self-fund. You know, the Fringe is a very expensive place to take a show, especially a show as big as ours with 12 people. So that was a scary concept that we might be playing to one person a night. But by the end of the first week, it started to sell out, and then that first run sold out every night for the entire thing. So we made a bit of a way for ourselves that year. We came back the next year at a venue twice the size, 250 people, which also sold out completely that time for assembly. We came back the next year again at assembly at the GAT for the Gordon Aikman Theatre,
Hmm.
which is a 500 seat venue, and then last year we did the Circus Hub for Underbelly in their big top tent for 550 people. And yeah, it was full every single day. It seems to grow year on year exponentially, which is wonderful because it's all word of mouth and returning customers as well.
I was going
Yeah.
to ask you because that seems to be from the first year, the thing that a lot of people are looking for to turn up with a new show, maybe to get one man and his dog, and then to grow it from there. So was that word of mouth? Was it reviewed well right from the start?
Yeah.
How did it grow?
Yeah, great question. It was a bit of both. To start with, Alistair, it was all word of mouth. We couldn't get any reviewers to come and see it. Like we don't have any commercial backing. We didn't have any producers or promoters. It's just me. I'd never even been to Edinburgh Fringe, let alone performed there. I first pitched the show as a 2 hour production with an interval. And obviously the promoters of the Fringe said that's not how it works. Had to cut it down to an hour just to get it on. And so to start with, it was all word of mouth. Everyone who came would come back the next day with their friends, and then they come back the next day. So we went from 5 people to 150 people very quickly, and then the whole thing sold out. So you couldn't get tickets, and that I think was what worked for us. We became this show that everyone raved about, but no one could get tickets to because it was sold
Wow.
out. So as soon as we went on sale the next year, it started selling out again. And these days, the show's been reviewed over 60 times now, all of which have been glowing reviews, I'm very happy to say. So now we have that on our side as well, but we didn't to start with. It was just people loved it.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic story. And I think probably still quite a rare story too.
Yeah, sadly, yeah.
When people come along, what can they expect? What can audiences expect?
Wow, yeah. It's difficult to know what to say you should expect from Mythos Ragnarok because at the end of every show, Alistair, I come out and I talk to everyone. In fact, we all do. The whole cast comes
Right.
out. And depending on how many people have been there that night, I can be out there for over an hour just chatting with people about their experience of the show. So I can say firsthand from talking now to over 10,000 people who've come to see the show um, over the last 5 years around the world now, which is amazing. Um, that one of the things people say most is they didn't know what to expect, and
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why they were so entranced and blown away by it.
I
So I don't want
understand
to
that.
say what people should
Yeah.
expect specifically, but you should expect loads of fun. It's way more fun than people expect. They sort of think it's going to be quite serious and based in like old myths and things. It's incredible fun, incredible athleticism, wonderful storytelling. It's just joyful. It's a joyful expression of theatrical creativity put on by a bunch of people that genuinely love what they do. They're not a cast that have been hired by a promoter to fill a role. These are people who've been with me since the beginning, building this show from ground zero with nothing, up to where it is now, where we're in 8 different countries this year.
Wow. And who else is involved? What is your team? Who is your team?
They're all pro wrestlers, so everyone on the stage, with one notable exception, it comes from a professional wrestling background because the show isn't based on wrestling, but the fight scenes within the show, the action sequences are based on the art form of pro wrestling. So although it's a theater show, everyone in it has to be a trained professional wrestler, otherwise they simply wouldn't be physically capable of performing the show, let alone every day. The only person on the stage who isn't a professional wrestler is my girlfriend Mel, who does all the costume design, all the set design. She makes everything for the show, and she plays another one of the characters in it, but she doesn't do wrestling. And then we've got our team of 2 tech guys, the light and sound backstage, but that's it. There's 12 of us in total, whether we're on at the Fringe every day in a small venue or whether we're performing for the National Theatre in Switzerland, which we're doing in a few weeks' time. It's just the same 12 people that come around with me all around the world. So yeah, the people you see on the stage are the exact same people that have created this show. We're all emotionally invested in it. Yeah, it's a very strange, dysfunctional family of people that beat each other up for a living. Yeah, not like anything else.
What drew you to Norse mythology? Why was that something you always had an interest in?
Yes, I've always had an interest in Norse mythology ever since I was a kid and a teenager. I think a lot of teenagers get into mythology
Yeah.
because of, it's exciting. The stories are meant to be exciting. Um, what drew me to Norse mythology specifically for this show was the parallel that I saw between mythological characters and storylines and professional wrestling characters and storylines. These are big archetype characters getting to really ridiculous, oversized conflicts. The idea of Thor bashing people with a hammer to try and get his own way is almost like a direct analogy to a pro wrestler storming down to the ring and having to beat up all of his enemies to get his own way. I thought that that parallel between the way that pro wrestling does storytelling and mythology does storytelling, very character driven, very yeah, characters that are based on aspects of humanity. I thought that was really interesting and something I wanted to experiment with. And there is no better mythology to use than the grubby, fighty Norse mythology.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people will perhaps only have encountered it through Marvel comics or now Marvel films, but the actual mythology is really dark
Oh
and
yeah,
dangerous,
yeah.
and quite shocking in places as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you've pointed out, it's such fertile ground for theatre. The Norse myths are hilarious. Like they're totally ridiculous, and the characters are also ridiculous. But like you say, they're also very dark. They're very tragic. The storyline within Ragnarok, which is an adaptation of lots of myths that I've put together to make into one cohesive storyline, um, it plays out over much like a pro wrestling storyline over a long period of time. The wheels that are set in motion early in the creation of the universe will come to fruition later on in the destruction of the universe. So for everything that's hilarious, there's something that's dark. For everything that's sad, there's something that will make you laugh. And I think we've done a great job of balancing that in the show itself.
You said before you went to your first Fringe that it was like 2 hours with an interval. How difficult was it to shorten it down?
It's still so it's still 2 hours long.
Right.
When we tour of theaters, it's still
Yeah.
2 hours long with an interval. When we come to the Fringe, we have to do it in 80 minutes.
Right.
This year will be the first time we got 80. Normally it's 70.
Yeah.
And it's ludicrous trying to get it down without, because you don't want to do it faster, because otherwise you lose all the dramatic tension, but you also don't want to cut anything out because it's all good stuff. Um, Fortunately for me, a lot of what's great about pro wrestling is the pageantry, is the music. This year, by the way, we have all new music. It's all been scored for us by an amazing Nordic composer, which is super exciting.
Fantastic.
But yeah, it's the pageantry, the pro wrestling intros, all the lights and that sort of thing. That's one of the things that makes pro wrestling really exciting, and that's part of our show. So the benefit to that is that it's quite easy to speed that bit up a bit if you need to save some time. You give someone 30 seconds to get out into the ring rather than 2 minutes. So there are ways that we can shorten it without reducing the drama of the show. But it's certainly got to the point now that the show's really outgrown its fringe length,
Yeah.
sadly. So it's unclear how long we can keep doing it at
Yeah.
Edinburgh before we're killing it off a bit.
That seems a real shame that is. And is that just these are Edinburgh? This is Edinburgh. These are our rules. Is it that simple as that?
Um, there are some shows that go a little bit longer, but yeah, I think it's lots of things. It's a programming issue. You know, if you're 2 hours long, that's two slots. So
Yeah.
that takes up someone else's slot. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's not cheap buying a slot at Edinburgh Fringe, you know. So if you end up paying twice as much for it
Yeah.
with the same audience size, that's a struggle.
Of
Um,
course.
Audiences also they don't necessarily want to sit there for 2 hours. They don't people don't come to the Fringe to see one thing. They come to
Yeah.
see 5, 6, 10, 50 things. They don't want to be there for 2 hours, and they don't really want to pay 30, 40 quid for a theatre ticket. They want to buy a whole bunch of tickets for between 5 and 20 quid. So we have to fit into that, and I think
Yeah.
it's our responsibility. You can't just come and impose yourself on the Fringe. I think you need to be part of the festival. We just need to make sure we still do that whilst doing justice to our show.
Yeah, they're really interesting because I think people know that there's comedians who feel that they've maybe outgrown a normal Fringe run, then they come and they do two big shows and then away or whatever. But I
Yeah.
don't think people think that theatre can do the same thing, that you get to the stage where we're playing much bigger places elsewhere, or we can put on
Yeah.
longer shows and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of the purpose of the Fringe really is twofold. I think for a lot of people, one is you get to perform every day, so you get
Yeah,
better, your show
yeah,
improves, and you get seen. You know, a lot of people go to the Fringe. You're not going to make any money. You might make money if you're a solo comedian. I don't know. It seems tough. We're 12 people. I
yeah,
have to accommodate 12 people in Edinburgh for a month.
yeah,
We don't, our ticket prices are no higher than anyone else's. Our income is no higher than anyone else's. Our expenses are humongous. So I
yeah,
know I'm losing money, but I go
yeah,
there to drill the show, to improve the show, to get feedback from the audiences, and to share it. It's a celebration every year.
yeah,
So that's why you go to the Fringe, because you're hoping to go on to something else. So a lot of shows will then, obviously, as you know better than me, Alistair, they'll transfer, say, into the West End, or they'll go touring, and they're not doing a Fringe version of their show on the
No.
West End. They grow the show out. What we've done is kind of outgrow the Fringe, make a bigger version of our show, but then keep coming back to the Fringe and shrinking ourselves down again because we love it. And that I don't think happens often. Like Six, the big musical at the moment, they're not coming back to the Fringe. They're
Yeah.
not stripping themselves back down again. They're on the West End now. We're the opposite. We've gone up and we're coming back down, and I think that's what makes it so exciting and changes all the time.
Have you seen the Fringe change over the 5 years that you've been doing
Hmm.
it?
Yeah, I'm aware that 5 years doesn't exactly make me a veteran. There are people who've been doing the
Of
Fringe
course.
decades, but certainly what I do have an insight into, because I'm a one-man band, I produce it, I fund it, I promote it, I do it all of it myself. So I see it from everyone's point of view, not just the director, not just an actor. I've been planning this since December, it's a full-time occupation trying to work this sort of thing out. And yeah, the programming style is different, the audiences are different, the buying habits are different. People buy later. We over the 5 years we've seen a lot of our sales now come on the day, which
Yeah,
is scary as hell. When
I
you've got
bet.
15,000 tickets to sell and you've got a 700 seat venue to fill and you've only sold 200 tickets on the day, and you know that that's a loss. So that's scary. And of course, lots of fringe shows would kill to have 200 ticket sales on the day,
Yeah,
but most fringe shows don't spend tens of thousands of pounds on their promotional efforts.
yeah, and they're not in a
Um,
venue the size of the one that you're filling.
yeah, we have a lot of overheads to cover. So I've certainly seen that change. I've seen the style of shows change as well, which I think is interesting. There seems to be a lot more art these days. That seems to be more of an expression of someone's personal situation than maybe an expression about humanity or what it means to be a human, which I think is interesting. I don't know why someone would necessarily pay to see someone else talk about their own problems, but that certainly seems to be like a driving force behind a lot of art these days, which I think tells us something about what's happening with human
Yeah,
psychology and what we think is important these days. It's not about what we're all going through, it's about what me as
uh,
an individual is going through. I think that's weird and interesting. But yeah, it's a struggle, There's tourist taxes, the cost of the fringe go up every year. I don't know how sustainable that is, but that's
mm,
not for me to say, is it?
yeah, yeah. I think that's true. I think you can see on one sense, well, it's huge and it's a thriving month and all of those things, but you don't have to look too far under to see that there are major, major struggles, I think, for a lot of people. And without performers, it's done.
Yeah, a lot of people say that. I have to be careful because for me, it's been nothing but a
Yeah,
success.
no, no,
My,
absolutely. It's just,
um,
it's an interesting, when we're getting to these conversations, it's interesting to get feedback, particularly from people who have been doing it for a few years.
yeah. Well, I think what's interesting, right, is it's been a success for me. My show's gone from one person on day one to 600 people in year five, which is great, right? It's kind of not unprecedented, but that's a huge growth. And I think
Yeah.
partly because we keep coming back. But my show is also unique on the planet. There is no other show that does anything
Mm.
even close to what we do. So we stand out like a sore thumb in Edinburgh. There's 10,000 comedians, there's 10,000 theatre shows. There's only one that does anything like what we do. So you don't have to weigh it up against something else, like which comedian will we see? There's
Yeah.
not like which fight show, which pro wrestling mythological fight show are we going to see? There's only one. So obviously it's worked for me because the hardest thing about Edinburgh is differentiating. We differentiate naturally, right? So it's easier for me. On the flip side, that's why I took it to the Fringe because it's different. If my show was just the same as everyone else's show, why would don't write something that's the same as what everyone else has written, take it to the most competitive environment on earth, and then moan because no one came to see it.
Yeah.
It's as an artist, it's your responsibility to create something that people want to see and put it in their face. Like you take that burden on as a performing artist. No
Yeah.
one, it's not given to you. So I'm willing to accept that my success is because it's a unique show, but that's goes hand in hand. It went there
Yeah.
because it's a unique show and that's why it's done well. So I think you have to be careful criticizing the Fringe. I really do think it has the capacity to be the best stage that you can possibly hope for as a performing artist, but that's on you
Yeah.
to make the most of it. So
But that's really uplifting to hear, actually. So we spoke about the mythological aspect and why that's in there, but what about wrestling? How did you come to wrestling?
Yeah, I've loved wrestling as long as I've loved mythology. I turned it on as a kid, and I never turned it off. I decided immediately that I wanted to be a pro wrestler. You have a choice about what you do with your life, right? And I saw that, and I thought that's the single best thing a person can do. You get to embody a godlike character. You get to live out these ridiculous storylines. You get to perform for people and make them feel these wonderful and all the same things that draw people to wanting to be a theater actor or a screen actor. You get the same thing in wrestling, but it's live. It's right in front of people. You don't have to wait to the end of the show for everyone to stand up and tell you you've done a good job. They'll respond to you right there and then, which is great when you're doing well, but it's even better when you're doing badly. Because you don't learn any faster than doing your best thing and everyone boos you or says nothing, like a comedian. That's
Yeah.
why wrestlers and comedians and clowns are so similar. The response, the feedback is immediate. You don't wait for a review. Someone will boo you there and then if you're rubbish. So I loved that as a kid, and I decided I was going to do that. And that's what I've done. So that was 24 years ago. I got into wrestling as a hobbyist. I became a pro wrestler within the UK, doing my wrestling thing. And then as time has gone on, I transferred that skill set into stunt work, which is, again, the performance of fight scenes for entertainment. And
Right?
from there into theatre, where I realized it was a combination of all the things that I love doing. So yeah, you go to school like anything else. You
Yeah.
find a training school, you get beat up, you're really, really bad for a really long time, and then you slowly get better. And yeah, if you're lucky.
Yeah, well, and it does seem to be an area where you can have longevity.
Pro wrestling.
Yeah, pro wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Certainly, if you get it right, but
Yeah.
also it is people use the word fake about wrestling a lot, which is a gross misunderstanding of what we do. It's there are storylines that play
Yeah.
out, and we're not trying to hurt each other or literally beat one another, but the physicality of it is phenomenally real.
Yeah.
And the lifespan of a wrestler, you can make it into your older years, but your body won't follow. You'll get there, but you have to be really careful with yourself. So you're right. As a career, when it goes well, it goes really well, and they are some of the best paid performance artists on earth are
Yeah.
professional wrestlers. But for 99.9% of us, you get paid 30 quid and maybe get a free beer, and
Yeah.
then you have to go back to your day job. So yeah, it's I believe I'm correct in saying it's the last remaining primarily working class performance art. Most performing artists come from a middle class or upper class
Yeah.
background because they need the freedom to be able to perform. And that's not wrestlers. We don't
Yeah.
come from that background. We got two or three jobs that we do on the side
Yeah.
to fund our habit of wrestling. So that's why it's a real honor to be championing that performance art. Because no one else is. It's just
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. While you're up in Edinburgh, will you get a chance to see anything else, or is it just the show and recovery? It
Yeah,
sounds like
I
it's such a physical show. It is about recovery, a lot of it.
it is. And to be honest with you, as hard as the show is, that's only 20% of what I do up there. Performing the show is what I do in the evening. The daytime is promoting the show, having interviews about the show, trying to get the show booked in other places.
Mhm.
I'm up there as an actor, but I'm also there as a director, and I'm also there as a producer and the promoter. So when I'm
Yeah.
not doing one, I'm doing the other. That's what kills me, is
Yeah.
I don't get in till 2 in the morning, but I have to be up again at 6 or 8 or
Mhm.
whatever, depending on what's up for the day. So that's what does me in, Alistair. So I don't have a lot of time to see anything. Mel and I, we normally have an agreement that we will start seeing shows only when our show is sold out. And the bigger the venue gets, the harder that is to
Yeah.
do. But there's a bunch of stuff that I'd like to go see. I really love other physical theatre, but and the acrobatics because I have a real appreciation for what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
And I go see storytelling. They're my two
Two.
favorite things. One man shows or big spectacular things. They're my go-to.
Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. Before we finish up, it'd be good to tell people again where and when people can see you, and maybe where they can learn more about the show.
Yeah, absolutely. We're on the assembly rooms more or less every night at 9:30 in the evening, which is a wicked slot for us because you can have a beer, you can get in the mood, and then you can come and throw down. Honestly, it's the most bonkers thing you've ever seen at the Fringe. I,
Sounds
I guarantee. If you disagree, find me afterwards and I'll refund you. I've said that for 5 years. I've said if this isn't the best thing you've ever seen at the Fringe, find me and I'll refund you. And not one person has ever. And I'm there. I stand outside. No one comes. We're on 9:30 every evening in the assembly rooms. Um, yeah. if you want to find out more about us, Mythos Ragnarok.co.uk is our website. You can just Google Mythos Ragnarok. We've been around for 5 years. We have 60 different reviews floating around the internet, tens of thousands of photographs, loads of videos. We're the easiest show on earth to find. Just Google it. Or you can buy tickets through on the Assembly website. Just stick Mythos Ragnarok in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I say every year, if it's not the coolest thing you've ever seen, just come find me and we'll fight.
Ed, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me, and all the very best with the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Alistair. It means a lot to me to have an opportunity to talk about it. So thank you.
And I'm delighted to say I'm now joined by artistic director and performer Sadiq Ali. Hello, Sadiq.
Hello, good morning.
And we're here to talk about your show, Tell Me. And what can you tell us about Tell Me?
I like that. All of the jokes and innuendos are starting already. Tell Me is a brand new circus theatre show that we're bringing to Edinburgh Fringe this year at Summer Hall. We'll be there for the run at 7 o'clock each day. It's my third production that I've created, and this one is a three-cast circus show that uses aerial cubes, Chinese pole, physical theatre, beautiful dance choreography, and lighting to tell the story of HIV, of stigma, where we are now. To do that, I look at two characters. I play a man in 1984 called Michael, and another performer plays the lead woman, Grace. And we have two parallel stories happening at the same time, one of the past, one of the present, and then they come together to kind of look at where we are now and where we might go, what the feeling is, what hope is. And it's really it's a show about not de-queering, but taking away, like moving on from HIV or AIDS narratives as just a gay male story, by putting a lead woman in the role, because that is more realistic to where we are now. But ultimately, it's a show about anyone that's had something that they feel separates them, a secret, something that you struggle to tell a partner or a lover, and how that might give us shame or hold us back, but how we can come together to overcome that. It's a piece about unity, of hope, of little bits of sexy dancing times, but ultimately it's a coming together.
We'll dig into the story a little bit more because I'm really interested in that later. But first of all, you mentioned aerial cubes. You're going to have to describe what those are.
So I built this structure, and the first thing I built was a 4.5 by 4.5 meter cube. And that's because I work with Chinese poles, and Chinese poles are kind of like, I call it extreme pole dancing. They're very big poles that you climb and do drops and acrobatics and dance on. And I wanted 4 of them, so we've got one in each corner. And that was great, and I liked that as a stage. And I looked at it and I went, I want another cube. And so I made a 2 by 2 meter cube, and then the one that sits inside the larger cube becomes the different rooms that we move through: the club, the dark room, the clinic, and that moves around the space. And then part way through the show, it's rigged up and it starts to move and fly with the performer. And then there's another one that then goes in it. And so by the end of the show, we have this quite hypnotic apparatus that I think it's incredibly stunning. I'm very proud of it. And it's a very interesting use of apparatus and structures that the performers physically move on.
It sounds amazing, I have to say. When is it a particularly big space? It sounds like it would have to be a big space.
So we are in Summer Hall upstairs in the dissection room, and it's not
Yeah.
massively larger than a usual theatre space. Depending on where you are, we've played the Lowry and the Keys Theatre, and that is a bigger space, and it looks amazing because you have perspective away. But this is a smaller space, and it just fits, but then there's a much more intimacy. So you are going to feel the heat and sweat from us in this space. And that has its own kind of like beauty around it.
Yeah. I was going to ask you what audiences can expect, but it sounds like the audiences can
Heat.
expect heat and, as you say, literally feeling the sweat. Because Now, if I've got the right thing, the Chinese poles, I mean, there's a lot of movement involved on them as well, isn't there?
Indeed. I come from a circus background. I trained at London's National Centre for Circus Arts. I used to do youth circus and stuff in Edinburgh. And I have been working professionally as a circus artist and creator for about 10 years. I'm really interested in dance artists and physical theatre. And so the cast I work with cross between dance and circus. The Chinese poles then become, with that combination, a narrative storytelling tool that, while it's quite spectacle, we move through pole dance moves, circus moves, dance moves, but they help to tell the story. I love Chinese poles as a theatrical tool, and I really love finding this middle ground of storytelling with circus, and I think it's quite a unique approach to circus.
I'm smiling because one of my questions is there a balance to be struck between performance and storytelling? It sounds like that's exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, often it's about taking out your ego. We want to put a human flag in. We want to put our biggest drops in. We want to because our circus ego goes, oh, I need to put my hardest technique in, and then often actually that doesn't lend to the story. And sometimes it's about stripping that away so that the movement is the story rather than distracting from the story. There's elements where it definitely fits, and I create scenes where the characters are having fun so that we can have some of that in as well. But yes, it's always a balance of storytelling and movement and how abstract or emotive some scenes are. And so there's definitely moments in the show where it's the feeling of a world or it's a bit more surreal, and that lends towards some of the more movement pieces. And then there's areas where we're in quite a very clear world. We're in the clinic. It's very clear where we are, and it's a bit more strict, both choreographically and narratively.
So why was this a story that you particularly wanted to tell?
I was diagnosed with HIV in my first year of circus school, so 2014. That's over a decade now. And in that very first year, early on in my training, I noticed people distance from me, and we work very physically together in circus. And I was starting to come to terms with what it meant to be living with HIV, at the same time as knowing that the news about me had kind of spread outside of my own control.
Right.
And I was watching people distance, but I was also watching who came closer. And some of those people that came closer are people that are still in my life now. The dramaturge I'm working with on this show was one of the people that held me through that moment of time. And so I'm really interested both in just this being my first combination of the circus world and then the HIV activism that I went on to do with Terence Higgins Trust and GMFA and different campaigns over the last however many years, and my performance world. It's the first time those two things are coming together. But it's a piece that I just see the need for updating. I love shows like It's a Sin, Pose. I love I love the narrative that we have historically is represented so well, so dramatically, and yet I'm often left with, but the audience haven't been updated.
Yeah.
The audience have still been left in the 80s. And does this work still enhance or strengthen outdated stigma? And so that's where this one comes from. And it's nice to see things like Tiptoe on TV just now, actually doing this at the same time. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is just landing at the right moment where we're going, where are we now with these stories that have been our historical narratives? What is it now? So I feel like maybe we've just done that at the right time. There's a creative consciousness going on right now around it.
It's really interesting because I think you're right. A lot of stories when they're told about AIDS and HIV is to go back to times and places, particularly the 80s. I just read a novel actually called Waiting on a Friend by Natalie Adler, which is New York in the 80s, and the incredible impact that they made at the time. And I think we kind of, because for some people it'll be, oh, that's something from the past, which is why you're going back to the past in the kind of time shift thing. And then for other people, perhaps when they're faced with someone with HIV, then suddenly all sorts of prejudices hit in that they maybe didn't even know they had.
Absolutely. It's because the last big campaigns were the falling tombstones on
Yeah.
the TV, and that's still where your head goes. I remember my sister saying, when I told her, just breaking down crying, going, "But you're going to die," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, we have work to do here."
Wow.
But that's it. It's different now. It is different. We live full happy lives living with HIV. We can't pass it on if we're on our medication. We are in a very different place, but then people are still dealing with the stigma and shame that surrounds it, which just doesn't line up with the reality. And then when making this work, I worked with Positively UK, who are a charity that was founded for women living with HIV and to help with the perspectives, because obviously I'm a gay man diagnosed with HIV, and that is one perspective, and I didn't want to apply my perspective and experience onto the character and onto the other performers, and working with them, realizing that much of that fight around sexual shame, stigma that we might have dealt with when it comes to women living with HIV is it's massively there. The slut shaming, the whatever else that puts, I don't know, it just it's I'm a marginalized performer looking at HIV as an issue and going, wait, there's even an invisible, I'm struggling for the right word right now. My apologies. But even within what I'm looking at is as this space, there's an even more invisible narrative within there. And I sit with my diagnosis. I am absolutely fine. I'm stronger than I've ever been. I enjoy my circus. I enjoy my movement. So how can I use my experience to then just make a bit of a space for what's even more invisible, but is more current, I guess.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a ramble, that one.
Well, I think it's
Snip,
interesting
snip.
telling a story. I mean, perhaps it would have been more straightforward to tell your story or something like it, but by telling a story that is lesser known, then that's more interesting again, I think.
I think for me, this one is great because it's not my story.
Yeah.
It's based on my experience, which is the seed, but it's very much researched with other people and developed. And so it's partly my story, it's partly fictional, it's partly other people's story. The character I play, for example, is one of my choreography consultants that I worked with. It's based on real letters from their brother to their mother when they were dying of HIV and AIDS. And so the character I play is based in real stories, and that brings real power to it. I've worked with incredible creatives on this. Choreography support from people like Jonathan Lum, who worked with Philip Glass, Junior Cunningham, who works with Motion House. My dramaturg is Rishi Trika, who's the professor of drama at London Metropolitan. And I'm sitting there going, like, how am I in the room with these people? And actually what we're making is a devised work, and we're all chipping in together, and we're all having these really special moments in the room, realizing that we're making something that is important to all of us, even though we're all crossing different generations and genders. And ultimately I hope that translates to the audience as well, is a feeling of this is about all of us and for all of us.
So, what is that collaborative process like in kind of practice? Do you start with a story and then discuss how you're going to tell it, how you're going to represent it?
Sure. Working as a company, Sadiq Ali company, I established at the start of this year to bring together my working practices, and I come with a concept and an idea and a journey of a narrative that I want to see in a work. And then I populate that in terms of movement and storyboarding and sound and lighting and costume with the team I work with. And I don't know how someone would walk into a room and do anything else, because in circus we're so collaborative in how we make. And I think it's a creative treat to be able to turn and take and accept and grow ideas together. And then ultimately, when it comes to rehearsals at the end, I have to go yes, no, yes, no.
Yeah.
But the actual development process it's um smorgasbord. Why is that the word in my head of different ideas? And that means that we all have a bit of ownership of this work.
Yeah. And it does seem to me you do like to challenge yourself physically when you're doing your shows. Last time we spoke was for Stuntman, and that was a pretty physical undertaking as well.
I think that was an hour and 10 minutes of being smashed into the floor.
God, it was an incredible show. But is that true? Is that part of it? Is part of it really challenging yourself, or is that just part of your experience and what you do as an artist?
I love it. I don't know what I'd do else. Ultimately, I have the joy of having a career and an art form that also keeps me really fit. So I'm like, I love it. I also like to push what we can do physically. And I guess, yes, I like the challenge. It is my joy in it.
Do you have other backup performers in case someone pulls a muscle? Or is it all on the line every night?
Um, yeah. For Edinburgh Fringe, I've got my physios in place for everybody, and we've got a good amount of rest time. I'm making sure we don't do the full run every day like some performances do. I think it's unrealistic and unsafe for the physical performance of a show like this. So we're going to do 5 shows a week,
Right.
2 days off, and I'm going to touch wood right now that it all goes well and bodies go well. The reality is we work physically, and if we have to adapt things, we have to adapt things. I did a show last year where sadly I had to get cancelled because of an injury, and
All right.
all we hope is that we can do everything in place to not do that. We do not have backup performers, so um it would be a quick training, and ultimately this show is made about the people that are on stage and their bodies. So like you come to see what we've made based on them, and it will be fine, and our bodies will be fine. And
Cool.
I'm like sitting here going fingers crossed now.
Eh,
um
the show has been elsewhere, has it? Yeah.
so Tell Me started as an outdoor show. I wanted to make a show about HIV that went into public spaces and took up public space. And that was very much a show that was based on the now, the present, and the female narrative. And when I made that, I realized that there was an indoor version I wanted to make because the female present narrative was great. And then I was like, but I do want to reflect on the past. And that's why I've started to make this work that has 2 parallel narratives. And we have done 4 performances so far to kind of preview premiere the show. So we did the Lowry in Salford, we did the Place in London, we did Worthing Theatres and Edinburgh Manipulate Festival. So it's been out 4 times only. It is a brand new work. And that was its first time in front of audiences in some really big theatre spaces. And now I've got a little bit of time to rethink the work, to see any little touches. There's a couple of little bits I want to change, and we go back into rehearsals in around 2 weeks and hit the ground running to Fringe.
Well, which is coming up quickly, as I'm sure you're aware.
It is. Yeah.
You said there that you're doing 5 days then with a couple of days off. Will that mean you'll have time to see other things, or will you just be recovering from a week of shows?
I hope so, because we're a 7 p.m. show, that works really well for me. I'll see work during the day.
Yeah.
And I love Edinburgh Fringe for that because it's not only about me getting my work out, it's also the time of year where I have the most artistic and professional development by just absorbing
Yeah.
work that I either love or don't love and experiencing that. And Edinburgh Fringe is a special place for my own growth as an artist. So absolutely. However, I do have friends who already have Excel sheets of 5 shows a day, and I am not that person. So there's different ways to do Fringe. I'll do 1 show a day, maybe that, and prepare for ours. But I'm very much looking forward to that. Especially
Excellent.
we have this 7 o'clock slot at Summer Hall, and I'm like, that's ideal for me.
So that's when it is, 7 o'clock, Summer Hall. What a perfect time and
It's
place.
great.
You
It's
know,
great.
that's if you could have had your pick, that's pretty much
That's
it.
it. I'm very fortunate, and Summer Hall is home turf.
Yeah.
We made a lot of the show there. We are. It's like family. Summer Hall is family, home space. Stuntman was there.
Yeah.
My very first show, The Chosen Haram, was there. I love it. It's home. It's home team.
Sadiq, it's great to catch up and see you again. All the very best with Tell Me and with the Fringe.
Thank you, and hope to see you there.
And now I'm delighted to be joined by writer-director Dan Bishop to talk about the show Target Audience. Hello, Dan.
Hey, Alistair, how's it going? All good?
Really well, thanks. Really well. Tell us all about target audience.
Yeah, of course. So Target Audience is a new comedy satire play that's set in a TV production company that gets bought by a big tech company with links to a weapons manufacturer. And so in an attempt to sort of sanitize the defense industry, the producers are tasked with writing a pro-weapon sitcom. So they bring in this sort of hotshot new writer, Tobias, and they ask him to write this show, and he has to choose between his morals and his mortgage. But yeah, that's the show.
I think it's such an interesting idea. And yeah, we'll get stuck into the idea in a moment. But for now, where and when can people see the show? Where are you on?
Yes, so we are at Pleasance Above at 4:50 from the 5th to the 30th of August, not the 17th though. That's our day off. But yeah, that's where we are.
I was talking to someone else just recently about Pleasance Above and what a great venue it is. So
Yeah. Last year I did a show called Brain Sluts last year. That was another kind of comedy play that was about setting a clinical drugs trial, and that was sort of about the gig economy. And that we did that at Pleasance Dome, which was really nice as well. But I think Pleasance Above, it's just like I think it's that next step up for us because it's kind of a bigger venue.
right.
And I'm looking forward to it.
And what can audiences expect from target
Yes.
audience?
Yeah, so all the so I guess it's quite similar to my play that I did last year in the sense that it's very much play, but it's there's lots of gags, and it's supposed to be it's sort of make you laugh, make you think. But yeah, so people will be able to have a good laugh. Lots of the actors are really fantastic comedians as well. So two of the actors, Molly Windus, I actually used to be in a double act with called Mudfish, and she is a fantastic comedian. She's also doing her own show, which is actually a one-woman theatre show called Rock Pools. It's wonderful, and she's in it, and she's fantastic. There's also this comedian called James Coward who's in the cast, and I really like working with comedians. I think there's a sort of do-it-yourself sort of attitude that I think lots of comedians sort of bring to the process, which I always like, and everyone kind of mucks in. The audience should expect a laugh, but also it's trying to talk about, I guess, it is hopefully a kind of war satire in the tradition of things like The Great Dictator and Doctor Strangelove and In the Loop and things like that. So it is, it's not shying away from any issues at the same time. Hopefully there's a kind of balance there of kind of politics and slightly provocative comedy, but also still some kind of accessible laughs along the way.
Have you shown it elsewhere, or is this the first time it'll be?
No, this will be the first outing. So we're going to do a few previews before, but I've just been just kind of writing it over the course of the last year, and we did what I quite like to do, again, kind of working with comedians, is something that I kind of tend to workshop it in a similar way that comedians do kind of work in progress shows. So often with script in hands, just like rent out a small kind of room in a pub theatre or something, and just kind of hear it out loud, see where the joke's landing, what can be punched up, what is working, what isn't working. So we've done a few of them to sort of find all the gags and the pacing. But we haven't done, this will be its sort of debut outing.
And in terms of the inspirations behind the show, what was there one set of things that really thought, this is what something to explore?
Yeah, well, I think it was a couple of things. I think I used to work at a literary agency where I would meet quite a lot of American producers who'd want to buy the rights to books to turn them into kind of TV shows and films in America. And there was the language they used was really kind of cryptic and euphemistic, and often it was the kind of briefs that were coming from these big streamers who maybe aren't that interested in TV but are interested in kind of selling TV shows. And there was one phrase that they always used, which was they're looking for muscular IP. I was like, what could that mean, muscular IP? And then we kind of interrogated one of them about it. And they were like, oh, this is a brief from Amazon, and that Amazon have got this brief from the White House because they were kind of in cahoots, and the kind of White House wanted more TV content that was kind of less woke liberal stuff and more appealed to the kind of muscular, kind of heteronormative white male fantasy of the kind of middle America. And so it's just a sort of weird, I don't know, it was a kind of weird example of like this one word that sort of actually meant quite a lot of quite scary things kind of trickled down to me as an intern in this literary agency, taking a note, being like, oh, muscular IP. And I just thought, oh, it's just kind of it's funny how obviously it's not kind of completely direct, but there were some sort of directives from the kind of political sphere into the media sphere. And I think, yeah, once I started pulling out that thread, I did more research into it, and yeah, like finding out that often actually the American Defense, the kind of Department of Defense or the Department of War now, has like final say on quite a lot of Hollywood scripts. If they let them borrow all their tanks and their helicopters and stuff for a big kind of movie. So Top Gun's the kind of big example of this, where Top Gun, apparently the CIA were kind of going through the script being like, well, you don't portray the military that well in this line, so how about we kind of make it look a bit better here, look a bit better here. I think when the original one came out in the 80s, they even had like people from the army sat outside movie theaters to try and conscript people. So I think, yeah, just pulling out a thread and learning more about that, I was like, oh, this is just a really weird world. And I think with the way that geopolitics is at the moment, it felt like something that was quite timely. And I think, yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about war as well, I guess.
Yeah, I do love this idea of Pete Hegseth sitting in it, just going, yes, tick.
Yeah, exactly.
I approve of it. I mean, you mentioned some of the previous examples of political satire, and I mean, it's got a long history going, way back before.
Yeah, of course.
TV. Yeah. But what you're doing, it does feel incredibly contemporary and relevant to today. And I was thinking about, I've heard Armando Iannucci talking about why he stopped doing Veep, and it was because it was so hard to satirize what the real world was. Right? And do you have kind of sympathy with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's such an interesting point. I think it's really hard. I guess, yeah, lots of people talk about it with Trump, don't they, where it's like he's so ridiculous that parodying it doesn't quite work, or it doesn't land. I think that's why, rather than sort of personality driven satire, I've tried to kind of look at the kind of the I guess the kind of shadowy forces behind quite a lot of these kind of nefarious things that are happening in kind of the media. So for me, it's more about these. I'm trying to sort of get to grips with those big tech companies that maybe don't have a kind of front-facing person that you can kind of make a puppet out of and turn into a kind of a clear symbol of everything that's wrong. Like, I think it's much more complex and elaborate. So yeah, I think the kind of companies that I was kind of doing a lot of research into were people like Palantir, the kind of AI data optimization company that has been involved in a lot of kind of drone warfare in Iran at the moment with the American military. But then they also do data optimization for, well, they had a contract with the NHS that I may or may not go through, but it seems like it is going through. But they've had contracts with ICE in America for these for the deportation. So it's this kind of quite shady company that, because I know it's so hard. Well, I find it so hard to understand what they actually do, that it's kind of easy to sort of ignore because you can't really get to grips with it. So I've been trying to try and sort of kind of illuminate on that and kind of ask what they're doing. And yeah, I don't know.
Has there been anything while you're doing research that has really kind of surprised you or expecting what you found?
Yeah, well, I suppose the thing that sort of always baffles me is that, I guess Amazon, I think, is probably the clearest example of this, where, I mean, they're the biggest online retailer in the world, but they also are now, because they bought MGM Studios, they're a huge movie studio, but then their Amazon Web Services is a platform that hosts AI software that is used in all this drone warfare in Iran. And actually, these drone strikes that happen in Iran and the missile strikes, it wouldn't work without Amazon. And you're like, what?
Mm.
Amazon? That's where I get my toilet roll. I don't get that. How is that involved in? And then I guess what the show is really about is, well, I think that I guess the writer is like, oh, should I write this unethical kind of TV show? And but then he kind of needs to pay his mortgage, you know. And I guess like what's similar, I think, is at the moment as just a consumer, it's really hard to like. Obviously, I buy stuff on Amazon, and does that mean I'm complicit in the kind of Amazon Web Services? I mean, no, but sort of yes. So I don't know. I guess it's that. I just think it's quite hard now because all these big tech companies have seeped into all of our kind of all aspects of our lives. It's quite hard to untether yourself from them.
Do you find that they're actually kind of hiding in plain sight? They're not trying to hide a lot of these things. You can find it fairly easily.
Yeah, exactly. I think another example is like Google in 2018. There was like Project Maven, where Google signed lots of defense contracts with the Pentagon, and then loads of workers walked out and said, "Oh, we don't want anything to do with defense. We're a tech company. I don't want our technology to be used in kind of weapons that kill people." And Google actually wrote back on that, if my memory serves me correctly. And then 3 years later, they just signed another contract, and no one really did anything, because actually, if Microsoft have got a contract and Amazon have got a contract and Google have got a contract, then I mean you can't really win. Like, they're always going to win, and people have stopped kind of protesting it, from my understanding, within kind of Google. So I think they sort of are hiding in place, and they're too big to fail, really, I guess. So they can't, even if you can't boycott Google. So it's yeah.
I've a vague memory of them trying to push some other search engines a couple of years ago, so the kind of ethical search engines, but I don't think it ever really.
Yeah, I think there's one. I mean, unfortunately, they're all quite bad. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's those are the kind of companies I'm trying to take down with my 70-minute play at Edinburgh Fringe.
Good work. Now, you've been to the Fringe before. You mentioned you were there last year. Is there something you really enjoy about Edinburgh in August? Because it's a hectic time, as we all know.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of the thing where whenever I go up and I'm not doing a show, I'm kind of completely like, what, I need to be here. This is the best place on earth. And then whenever you are doing the show, it's to kind of week 3, and you're like, I can never do this ever again. But last year I was just so keen to. I was just like, oh, we were very lucky. We had a really nice run, and I think I'm just trying to keep the momentum up. And I had this idea, and I thought, let's just go for it again. And I mean, it's so much better than the day job. So it's good to. And it's nice to sort of, I think, I just got lots of friends who kind of revolve their year around this 1 month in August, and there's a real nice kind of community of people who go, and it's the most fun you can have, really.
Is there anything you're particularly looking forward to seeing? Anything that you've spotted in the program?
Yeah. What am I looking forward to seeing? I mean, well, a few plugs of things that I'm sort of vaguely associated with is. There's a character comedy show that I'm directing called Rob Preston Amazing Global Solutions, that is also in a pub quiz, and he's just an amazing comedian, and he was the lead in my play last year, and he's just fantastic, so I'm really excited for that. And then what else am I excited? Molly Windust, who is also in my play, she's doubling up doing another show called Rock Pools. That's kind of one-woman show that's very funny, very charming, about kind of a woman who hoards seaside themed objects. Right. And it's very, it's sort of one of those, it's very kind of, so the voice is so great, and then suddenly it becomes very moving in the kind of very seamless way that one person shows often can do. Those are my kind of 2 big things that I'm looking forward to.
And if someone was coming to the Fringe for the first time to put on a show, about the venue booked and all of those things, have any advice that you might give them?
Advice. I think I probably have, I could be accused of occasionally losing sight of the fact that this is supposed to be fun. And I think I got better at it. I think a few years ago, when I used to do a double act with this amazing performer Molly, we did something called Mudfish, and whenever we had a bad show, it was sort of she likes to remind me that I would sort of take myself off for 3 hours and eat a kind of huge curry by myself and not speak to anyone. And it's like, well, you're supposed to be enjoying it, and there are so many, like, if you've had a bad show, go and see something brilliant and feel inspired again. But yeah, I think it's such a privilege to be able to do it. So make the most of it.
That's good advice. If you can enjoy it, enjoy it. If you can't, go for a big curry.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, no.
Remind people again, show us target audience and where and when they can see it.
Yes, target audience 4:50 at Pleasance Above, 5th to the 30th of August, not the 17th. But yeah, would love to see that.
Well, thanks again, and all the very best with it.
Oh, thank you so much, Alistair. It's been so nice speaking with you.